In 1513, a man who had lost everything sat down to write a book that would haunt the next 5 centuries. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. Once a respected diplomat of Florence, he had been stripped of power, exiled from public life, and left nearly penniless. In the quiet isolation of the countryside, far from the political stage he once knew so well, he began to write what would later become one of the most controversial works in human history. Not because it was fictional, not because it was exaggerated, but because it was painfully accurate. What Machiavelli described about human nature was so unsettling that the Catholic Church eventually banned the book. Political leaders publicly condemned it. And over time, his name itself became a symbol of manipulation, cruelty, and evil. For more than 500 years, Machiavellian became an insult. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people never stop to consider. Machiavelli was not hated because he was wrong. He was hated because he described human behavior with such brutal clarity that it shattered the comforting stories people preferred to believe about themselves. Stories about loyalty, stories about love, stories about human goodness. Yet what Machiavelli observed was never only about princes or politics. It was about something far more universal: human psychology. The same psychological patterns that operate today in every relationship you have. With your partner, your friends, your family, your colleagues. Every smile, every promise, every moment of support. Because once you understand what Machiavelli truly documented, something subtle begins to change. You stop seeing people the same way. You stop trusting in the same naive way. And perhaps most importantly, you stop being surprised by betrayal. But here is the greatest misunderstanding about Machiavelli. He was not teaching people how to become evil. He was simply exposing the self-interested nature that already exists within every human heart, including yours. And the people who condemned him most loudly were often the very same people who quietly practiced the strategies he described, while publicly pretending to operate from noble principles. Today, we are going to look beyond the distorted version of Machiavelli that history turned into a villain, and instead examine what he actually observed about human nature. Observations that explain why a friend disappears the moment you truly need them, why love can fade when circumstances change, why support from family often arrives with invisible conditions attached, why colleagues smile to your face while quietly working against you. This is not theory. This is pattern recognition, a pattern that has repeated itself in human behavior for thousands of years, and it is still operating right now in the relationships around you. The only question is whether you will begin to see it clearly, or whether you will continue believing that the people around you are motivated by something nobler than they truly are. Let us begin with Machiavelli's own words, not the softened interpretations that appear in textbooks, but the sentence he wrote while living in exile, after he had been imprisoned, tortured, and stripped of everything he once possessed. From that place of loss, he wrote, "Men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, their property, their lives, and their children, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you." Read that again. Let the sentence settle. And notice what happens inside you when you hear it. There is almost always a quiet resistance, a voice that immediately responds, "That's too cynical. That's not true about everyone. I'm not like that." My people would never do that. But that reaction is exactly what Machiavelli expected, because he also wrote something equally revealing. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Human beings are extraordinarily skilled at performing loyalty. We display virtue. We signal devotion. We speak about principles. But beneath those performances, our decisions are often guided by something far simpler: self-interest. And what makes Machiavelli's observation so unsettling is that he did not exclude himself from this rule. He was not claiming that others were selfish while he remained noble. He was saying something far more uncomfortable. All human beings, himself included, operate primarily from self-interest. And understanding this reality is not pessimism. It is clarity. Without that clarity, you walk through life expecting loyalty that was never truly there. And that is why betrayal feels so shocking. But there is a simple way to test whether Machiavelli was right. Look at the people closest to you right now. The ones you feel certain love you unconditionally. The ones you believe will always remain. Now imagine something uncomfortable. You lose everything. Your money disappears, your status collapses, your health deteriorates, your abilities fade. Everything that once made you impressive, useful, or enjoyable to be around disappears. You become a burden rather than a benefit. Now ask yourself honestly, how many people remain? Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but out of genuine loyalty. The number that appears in your mind, that small, uncomfortable number, is often the most honest measure of human loyalty. Everyone else may still care about you, but many of them were there primarily because of what you provided, not simply because of who you are. And Machiavelli was not writing this as a condemnation of humanity. He was describing a pattern he observed repeatedly while watching human behavior under extreme pressure. During wars, political collapses, moments when survival depended entirely on loyalty. It was in those moments that the masks disappeared and human nature revealed itself. After years of observing human behavior under pressure, Machiavelli began to notice something disturbing, a pattern so consistent that it almost resembled a law of nature. Every human relationship, without exception, operates, at its foundation, on self-interest, even when people sincerely believe they are acting from love, from loyalty, from generosity. That is the uncomfortable truth that changes everything. Not that people are evil, not that love is impossible, but that human attachment almost always grows around what the other person provides. The provision can take many forms: emotional support, practical help, social connection, sexual attraction, financial security, psychological validation. Sometimes it is subtle, sometimes it is obvious, but it is always there. And when that provision disappears, attachment often begins to fade. If you doubt this, look carefully at your own life. You will start to see the pattern everywhere. Consider the friend who slowly vanished. For years you were close. You talked often. You laughed together. You shared your lives. But then something changed. Maybe you moved to a different city. Maybe you changed careers. Maybe you entered a relationship. Or maybe life became difficult, and you were no longer the fun, energetic version of yourself they were used to. Suddenly, they became busy. Messages went unanswered. Plans stopped happening. What changed? Most likely, the benefit that sustained the friendship quietly disappeared. Perhaps you were entertaining. Perhaps you provided social access. Perhaps you were useful in ways neither of you consciously acknowledged. But once that benefit faded, so did their interest. Or think about the partner who slowly lost interest. At one point, the connection felt absolute. They said you were everything to them. They promised loyalty. They spoke about the future as if it were guaranteed. But then circumstances changed. You lost a job. You became depressed. You stopped meeting certain needs that once held the relationship together. And suddenly, the love that once seemed permanent began to dissolve. What happened? The exchange that sustained the relationship became unbalanced. You began taking more than you were able to give. And human psychology rarely tolerates that imbalance for long. Or consider the family member who only calls when they need something. Months pass, sometimes years. There is silence. Then suddenly, a problem appears, a financial difficulty, an emotional crisis, a practical situation where help is required. And suddenly, they remember you exist. You are contacted, needed, important again, until the problem disappears. And with it, they disappear as well. This pattern is not unusual. In fact, it is remarkably common. Even family relationships that appear unconditional often contain exchanges that are simply less visible. But they are still there. The same principle appears in professional life. The colleague who once seemed like a close friend. You spoke every day. You trusted each other. But then something changed. Perhaps they were promoted. Perhaps you moved to a different department. Perhaps your careers began moving in different directions. And suddenly, the connection faded almost instantly. The friendship that once felt genuine quietly dissolved. Why does this happen? Because many relationships are not sustained by deep, independent loyalty. They are sustained by circumstances, proximity, shared interests, convenience, mutual benefit. Remove those conditions, and the relationship often reveals that it had no real foundation of its own. Machiavelli would hear these stories and respond with calm indifference. Of course this happened. What else did you expect? During his time observing politics, he noticed the same phenomenon on a much larger scale. Princes believed their subjects loved them personally. They believed their people were loyal to them as individuals. But the moment invading armies arrived promising lower taxes, greater security, or better conditions, those same loyal citizens welcomed the new rulers without hesitation. Why? Because their loyalty had never been about the prince himself. It was about what the prince provided. And once a better offer appeared, the attachment disappeared. Your relationships operate in much the same way. The attachment people feel toward you is rarely about you alone. It is about what you bring into their lives, the emotional comfort, the opportunities, the stability, the pleasure, the support. And when that provision changes, the relationship often changes with it. Understanding this does something important. It removes the shock from betrayal. Because what once felt like personal betrayal begins to look like something else. Human beings simply responding to incentives, responding to benefit, responding to self-interest, not maliciously, but predictably. To understand this fully, we need to look at the mechanisms Machiavelli believed governed human relationships. Patterns that operate quietly beneath almost every social interaction, whether people admit it or not. The first truth is simple. People stay for benefits, not for bonds. Machiavelli wrote something revealing. Men love according to their own will, but fear according to the will of the prince. In modern language, this means something very simple. Affection follows personal advantage. Respect follows strength. People feel affection when you provide something they value, but they show respect only when you demonstrate that you will not tolerate being treated poorly. And this distinction is crucial because many people spend their lives chasing affection while neglecting respect. They want to be liked. They want to be loved. They want approval. But they forget something important. Affection can disappear the moment circumstances change. Respect is far more stable, and that is why so many people feel confused when those who claim to love them treat them with the least consideration. Because affection without respect rarely protects you. You can see this dynamic clearly in romantic relationships. A partner rarely stays simply because of history, not because of the years you've shared, not because of promises that were once spoken. They stay because the relationship continues to meet their needs better than the alternatives available to them. The moment that calculation changes, everything shifts. If they meet someone who provides what you provide, plus something extra, or if you stop providing what once made the relationship valuable, the emotional bond that once felt unbreakable can dissolve surprisingly quickly. At first, this perspective sounds harsh, almost cruel, until you examine your own behavior honestly. Because if you look closely, you will notice something uncomfortable. You have done the same thing. The friend you slowly drifted away from. The partner you eventually lost feelings for. The hobbies you abandoned when they stopped bringing satisfaction. You did not leave because you were evil. You left because the balance changed. The cost became greater than the benefit, and human beings, almost instinctively, move toward what benefits them, and away from what does not. When you recognize this pattern, something important becomes clear. You were never evil, you were human, because everyone operates according to the same basic logic. The real question is not whether this dynamic exists. The real question is whether you will admit it, or continue believing that your motives are somehow purer than everyone else's. Look at professional relationships. Many people imagine their employer values them personally. That loyalty will be rewarded. That years of dedication build a permanent bond. But in reality, most organizations operate according to a far simpler calculation. Your employer keeps you as long as retaining you costs less than replacing you. The moment that calculation changes, the outcome becomes obvious. If replacing you becomes cheaper, if budgets tighten, if the organization restructures, you are gone. This is why employees who have worked faithfully for 10 or 20 years can be dismissed almost overnight. The late nights, the personal sacrifices, the times you went far beyond your job description. None of those things enter the final calculation. Once the cost-benefit analysis shifts, the relationship ends. Understanding this truth does something important. It removes the naive shock that comes when people discover their employer never truly cared about them personally. They cared about the value you provided. And once that value changed, the relationship changed. Family relationships are often believed to be the one exception. We are taught that family bonds are unconditional, that blood guarantees loyalty. But even family systems quietly operate according to exchange principles. Parents who invest resources in their children often expect support later in life. Siblings who grow up close may drift apart as their lives move in different directions. Family members who consistently take more than they give gradually find themselves excluded from gatherings and decisions. The exchange may be less visible than in professional relationships, but it is still there. And when someone repeatedly violates the implicit agreement, when they take without giving, create more problems than they solve, or demand support without contributing anything in return, even blood ties eventually lose their protective power. Machiavelli understood something important. Once you accept that relationships are sustained by exchange, you stop interpreting every change as personal betrayal. Instead of asking, "Why did they betray me?" you begin asking a different question. What exchange sustained this relationship, and what changed? That shift in perspective replaces confusion with clarity. This is where Machiavelli becomes even more practical. He once wrote, "Men never do good unless necessity drives them to it." What he meant was simple. Human beings naturally test limits. They push boundaries to discover what behavior will be tolerated. If they encounter firm resistance, they adjust. They respect the boundary and the person enforcing it. But if they encounter weak resistance, or none at all, they push further. This is rarely conscious cruelty. Most of the time, it is something much simpler. Human beings are wired to conserve effort and maximize benefit, which means we instinctively move toward taking more while giving less, until consequences appear that make that strategy costly. Once you begin observing this dynamic, you will see it everywhere. Think about the friend who constantly cancels plans at the last minute. Each time it happens, they are quietly testing something. Will you enforce consequences, or will you simply accept it? If you forgive the behavior every time without cost to them, they learn something. Your time is negotiable. Your plans are flexible. Your boundaries are soft. And once people learn this, there is little reason for them to change. The same pattern appears in romantic relationships. A partner who begins speaking disrespectfully is often testing the limits of what you will tolerate. If you protest briefly, but ultimately accept the behavior, the lesson becomes clear. Disrespect works, and what works tends to repeat itself. Think about what happens when someone realizes they can release frustration on you without losing you. You become a safe outlet for their anger, a place where they can unload stress, irritation, or resentment without paying any real price for it. From their perspective, this becomes extremely convenient. You are providing a service, but the cost is paid by you. The same mechanism appears with the colleague who quietly takes credit for your work. They are not just being opportunistic. They are running a test. Will you challenge them, or will you remain silent? If you allow it once, a lesson is learned. They can benefit from your effort without sharing the reward. And from a purely rational perspective, the conclusion becomes obvious. Why stop? The same pattern appears in families. A relative who contacts you only when they need help is not simply forgetful. They are testing the structure of the relationship. Will you continue giving, even when nothing comes back in return? If you repeatedly provide support without expecting reciprocity, the rule of the relationship becomes clear. Taking without giving is acceptable here. Machiavelli understood something fundamental about human behavior. People respect boundaries that are enforced, not boundaries that are merely spoken. You can explain your limits all day. You can tell people what you will or will not tolerate. But none of it matters if your actions contradict your words. What truly defines your boundaries is what you allow when those boundaries are tested. And this explains one of the most confusing dynamics in human relationships. The person who is always accommodating, always forgiving, always understanding, is often treated worse over time, not better, because they have unintentionally trained everyone around them that poor behavior carries no consequences. Meanwhile, the person who calmly enforces limits, who walks away when necessary, who creates real consequences when lines are crossed, is treated with far greater consistency and respect. Machiavelli expressed this principle bluntly when he wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved, not because fear is noble, but because fear is tied to consequences. Love depends on emotions, and emotions change. Circumstances change. Convenience changes, but consequences remain stable. Someone may stop loving you when it becomes inconvenient, but they rarely violate boundaries when doing so carries a real cost. Once you understand this principle, another uncomfortable realization appears. Many relationships where you feel disrespected, ignored, or taken advantage of are not simply happening to you. In many cases, you have unknowingly allowed them to develop. Through your actions, you have taught people that they can treat you that way, without losing access to you, without consequences. The moment that changes, the entire dynamic shifts. When real consequences appear, less contact, withdrawn support, or even the end of the relationship, one of two things happens. Either the behavior changes immediately, or the person leaves, and in both cases, the outcome ultimately benefits you, because you are no longer participating in a relationship built on imbalance. Machiavelli also understood something subtle about power, a principle that applies just as strongly to personal relationships. Total accessibility destroys value. Complete transparency removes intrigue, and constant availability slowly erodes attraction. For this reason, Machiavelli advised rulers to maintain an element of mystery, to remain somewhat unpredictable, to never become completely accessible or completely knowable. In modern relationships, this principle operates quietly but ruthlessly. Something subtle happens when a person becomes completely available, completely transparent, completely merged into someone else's life. They stop being an independent individual worth pursuing and slowly become a utility that can simply be accessed. This is one of the quiet reasons many romantic relationships begin to fade after couples move in together. The problem is not proximity itself. The problem is what people often do with that proximity. Instead of maintaining independence, they eliminate it. They share everything. They become constantly available. Their entire identity gradually merges into the relationship, and something important disappears. Mystery. The person who once felt intriguing becomes entirely predictable. The person who once needed to be pursued becomes permanently accessible. The individual who once stood on their own becomes an extension of someone else's life. And extensions are rarely attractive. They are utilities. Watch how this dynamic unfolds. At the beginning of a relationship, both people usually have full lives, friends, hobbies, ambitions, personal time. You share parts of your life, but not everything. There is space. There is curiosity. The relationship feels exciting because two complete individuals are choosing to spend time together. But then, the relationship becomes serious. Gradually, something changes. Friends disappear. Hobbies are abandoned. Every moment is shared. You become available 24 hours a day. Your entire world begins to revolve around the relationship. What once made you interesting slowly disappears. You are no longer someone they choose to spend time with. You become someone whose entire existence revolves around them. And when that happens, interest often fades. Not because the other person is shallow, not because they are cruel, but because the dynamic that created attraction has quietly vanished. Attraction is strongest when someone feels like a complete person, with a full life, who chooses to include you, not someone who needs you in order to have a life at all. Machiavelli observed a similar pattern among rulers. He noticed that the prince, who granted an audience to anyone who asked, quickly lost respect. His time became ordinary, accessible, common. But the prince, whose time was limited, whose attention was selective, was valued far more. Scarcity creates value. And the same principle appears in personal relationships. The person who is always available often becomes taken for granted. But the person whose time and attention remains selective remains valued. This pattern extends far beyond romantic relationships. The friend who is always free whenever you call slowly becomes the backup friend, the one you contact only when better options are unavailable. The professional who responds to emails at 2 in the morning teaches everyone around them that their time has no boundaries. The family member who always adjusts their plans for everyone else eventually becomes the one whose own needs are rarely considered. None of this requires cruelty or bad intentions. It simply follows the quiet logic of human behavior. But it is important to understand something clearly. Strategic distance does not mean playing manipulative games. It does not mean pretending to be busy. It means maintaining genuine independence, having your own life, your own interests, your own priorities, things that exist beyond any single relationship. Because that independence is what makes you interesting. You are not merely reflecting the other person's life. You remain a separate individual, someone worth discovering, someone worth engaging with, someone who is chosen, not simply accessed. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately. It is nothing more than basic power dynamics. In any relationship, the person who needs the relationship the least holds the most power, and the person who needs it desperately holds almost none. Dependence weakens your position. Independence strengthens it. When your emotional stability, your social life, and your practical needs depend entirely on one relationship, you place yourself in a vulnerable position. But when your life remains full and self-sustaining, the dynamic changes. You are choosing the relationship. You are not relying on it for survival. And that difference alone changes how people treat you. Because desperation is rarely attractive, and dependence often invites poor treatment. This brings us to Machiavelli's most famous and most misunderstood observation. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Most people focus on the word feared, but that was never the true insight. To understand what he meant, you have to look at his reasoning. Machiavelli wrote, "Love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken whenever it serves their advantage. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails." In simpler terms, his argument was this: affection is fragile, because affection depends on circumstances. People feel warmth toward you when you benefit them, when you help them, when your presence makes their life easier or more pleasant. But the moment those benefits disappear, affection often fades with them. Respect, however, operates differently. Respect is tied to consequences. When people know that certain lines cannot be crossed without cost, they adjust their behavior accordingly, and this makes respect far more stable than affection. This does not mean you should intimidate people. It does not mean threatening others. It means something much simpler. Respect is built when your boundaries are real, when they are clear, and when violating them consistently produces consequences. Think about the person everyone claims to love, but does not respect. People enjoy their presence. They are kind. They are accommodating. They are always understanding. But what happens over time? People cancel plans with them without hesitation. They ask for favors without returning them. They ignore their boundaries because they know nothing will happen. Now compare that with someone who may not be universally loved, but is consistently respected. People treat them differently. They honor commitments. They reciprocate favors. They think twice before crossing a boundary, not because they fear the person emotionally, but because the consequences are clear. This difference becomes obvious in professional environments. The manager who tries to be liked by everyone, who avoids confrontation and accommodates every request, often receives the least respect from their team. Deadlines slip, standards drop, authority weakens. But the leader, who is fair, consistent and firm, even if not universally liked, often receives stronger performance and greater respect. The same dynamic appears in personal relationships. The person who constantly forgives, constantly understands, constantly offers second chances, often finds themselves treated worse over time. But the person who calmly states a boundary, "Do that again, and I'm done," and then actually follows through, is treated very differently, because their words carry weight. Machiavelli understood the underlying mechanism. Human beings respond to incentives. Behavior that carries no cost tends to repeat itself. Behavior that produces consequences tends to stop. If someone treats you poorly and nothing happens, you have quietly taught them something. That poor treatment carries no cost, and behavior that carries no cost almost always repeats. But when poor treatment produces consequences, reduced access, withdrawn support, or even the end of the relationship, something interesting happens. People adjust. Either they begin treating you better, or they remove themselves from your life entirely. And in both cases, the outcome benefits you, because you either gain better treatment, or you remove people who were never willing to treat you well. What never benefits you is tolerating poor behavior indefinitely, while hoping that people will eventually choose to behave better out of kindness. Machiavelli understood something most people prefer to ignore. Hoping people will act better than their nature usually leads to disappointment. But structuring relationships so that their self-interest aligns with treating you well creates stability. And stability is what produces healthy relationships. Understanding these ideas intellectually changes nothing. Machiavelli was not writing abstract philosophy. He was documenting patterns learned through painful experience. So the real question becomes, how do you apply these principles in real life? How do you transform relationships that currently bring confusion or frustration into relationships that actually work? The process begins with 3 steps. Start by examining every significant relationship in your life. Ask yourself 2 simple questions. What benefit does this person receive from me? And what benefit do I receive from them? Then ask a third question. Is the exchange balanced, or is it clearly one-sided? When you find relationships where you are consistently giving far more than you receive, you have 3 choices. First, you can reduce your investment so that it matches the level of reciprocity. Second, you can openly renegotiate the dynamic and attempt to restore balance. Or third, you can end the relationship and redirect your time and energy toward people who actually reciprocate. Most people avoid doing this audit, not because it is difficult, but because the answers are uncomfortable. You may discover that some people you believed cared deeply about you are simply benefiting from your generosity. You may realize that relationships you have invested heavily in are not truly mutual. You may recognize that you have unintentionally volunteered for exploitation because you believed in comforting stories about unconditional loyalty. But clarity is always more valuable than illusion. Temporary discomfort that leads to awareness is far better than comfort that keeps you trapped in unhealthy dynamics. For every relationship you decide to keep, define clear boundaries. Be specific. What behavior will you accept? What behavior will you not accept? And most importantly, what consequences will follow if those boundaries are violated? This is where many people fail. They state boundaries, but never enforce them. Saying, "If you do that again, I'll be upset," is not a consequence. It is simply information. And if upsetting you carries no real cost, people will eventually ignore it. Real consequences are concrete. For example, if you cancel plans again without proper notice, I will stop making plans with you. And if it happens again, you follow through. Because a boundary that is not enforced teaches people something very clear, that your boundaries do not matter. Finally, protect your independence. Every relationship should exist alongside your life, not replace it. Maintain friendships that exist outside your romantic relationship. Develop hobbies that do not involve your family. Pursue professional goals that do not depend on a single colleague's approval or support. Independence keeps relationships healthy, because when your entire identity depends on one connection, the dynamic becomes fragile. But when you maintain your own life, your own interests, and your own direction, you remain someone who chooses relationships, not someone who depends on them for survival. And that difference changes everything. The next shift requires something many people find difficult. Stop trying to be liked by everyone. Start becoming respectable. Those two things are not the same. Being liked often means constantly accommodating the preferences of others, even when those preferences conflict with your own needs. It means avoiding tension, avoiding disagreement, avoiding boundaries. But being respectable means something different. It means having clear standards, clear principles, clear limits, and maintaining them, even when others disapprove. Paradoxically, this often produces a surprising outcome. You may be liked by fewer people, but you will be respected by far more. And the people who matter most, people with their own strength and principles, are usually drawn to those who possess the same qualities. The people who dislike you because you enforce boundaries were never the people worth accommodating in the first place. The final shift is psychological. Stop pretending your relationships operate purely on love or loyalty. Instead, become conscious of the exchanges that sustain them. This does not make you manipulative. It makes you aware. Ask yourself simple questions. What value am I bringing into this relationship? What value am I receiving? Is this exchange balanced? And most importantly, would this relationship survive if I stopped providing my side of the exchange? Relationships that remain strong under this examination are worth investing in. Relationships that collapse under it often reveal something uncomfortable. They were sustained primarily by what you were giving. And once that is clear, You can redirect your time and energy toward people who value you as much as you value them. At this point, many people feel a strong reaction. They say, "This perspective is too cynical. It destroys genuine connection. Not all relationships are transactional." Or perhaps the most common response, "I'm not like this with the people I love." Let's examine that. Cynicism means assuming people are worse than they actually are. Realism means seeing people as they truly are. Machiavelli was not writing from cynicism. He was writing from observation. He did not invent theories about human behavior. He simply documented patterns he repeatedly witnessed. And if those patterns feel uncomfortable, it may not be because the observation is wrong. It may be because human nature is less noble than we prefer to believe. Some people hear these ideas and immediately object. This way of thinking destroys genuine connection. But in reality, it often does the opposite. Because when you stop expecting unconditional loyalty and start building relationships on honest exchange, something interesting happens. Your relationships become real. They are no longer sustained by illusions. They are sustained by mutual value. The friendships that survive this clarity are authentic, and the ones that collapse were never genuine to begin with. Another common objection is this: not all relationships are transactional. But ask yourself honestly, can you name a single relationship that exists without some form of exchange? Consider your closest friendship. What would happen if you suddenly became a constant drain, offering nothing in return? No support, no presence, no value. Would that friendship remain unchanged forever? Or consider a romantic relationship. What would happen if you stopped meeting your partner's needs entirely? Every relationship contains an exchange, sometimes emotional, sometimes practical, sometimes social. Acknowledging this exchange does not create it. It simply reveals what was already there, and denying it does not eliminate it. It only hides it. Many people insist they are different, that they do not operate from self-interest with the people they care about. But if you examine your behavior honestly, a different picture often appears. You remain in relationships that bring more benefit than cost. You slowly drift away from relationships that become exhausting or one-sided. You invest more energy in people who invest energy in you. That is self-interest. And self-interest is not something shameful. It is simply human. Pretending otherwise does not make relationships purer. It simply makes people blind to the forces already shaping them. Understanding this truth offers something powerful: freedom. Freedom from naive victimhood. When you recognize that human beings operate from self-interest, betrayal stops feeling mysterious. You are no longer shocked when people act according to their incentives. You stop expecting others to sacrifice their interests for yours, especially when you would not do the same in reverse. This awareness does not make you cold. It makes you strategic. You can still care deeply about people. You can still love. You can still build meaningful connections. But you do so with clarity. You understand that loyalty often has limits, that circumstances change, and that relationships survive longest when they create value for both people involved. The person who understands human nature can build relationships that endure, because those relationships are based on sustainable, mutual benefit, not fragile fantasies. But the person who denies human nature keeps repeating the same cycle. Surprised, confused, blindsided by patterns that were entirely predictable to anyone who understood what Machiavelli observed. So the choice becomes simple. You can continue believing that people operate from motives far nobler than they actually do, and remain surprised each time self-interest appears, or you can accept Machiavelli's observation about human nature and use it to build relationships grounded in reality, relationships that actually work. Machiavelli himself died in exile, poor, condemned by the same society that accused him of cynicism. His work was banned. His name became synonymous with manipulation. Yet 5 centuries later, his ideas remain, not because they are flattering, but because they are accurate. Human beings are self-interested. Loyalty is conditional, and relationships are sustained by exchange. Uncomfortable truths, but truths that continue to describe human behavior with unsettling precision. Boundaries determine respect. Availability destroys attraction. These are not moral judgments. They are patterns. Patterns you can observe everywhere once you begin paying attention. And like all patterns of human behavior, they operate whether you acknowledge them or not. You can reject these ideas. You can continue believing that people operate primarily from loyalty, kindness, and noble intentions. Many people choose that path. They are the ones who feel constantly betrayed, the ones shocked when someone they trusted suddenly changes, the ones confused when their loyalty is not returned. They keep expecting human behavior to match the fairy tale they were taught, and every time reality contradicts that story, they suffer. But there is another option. You can accept these patterns and work with them. You can begin identifying the rare individuals whose self-interest genuinely aligns with supporting you. You can establish boundaries that people respect. You can maintain the independence that keeps you valuable and attractive. You can build relationships based on exchanges that benefit both sides, instead of one-sided arrangements that eventually collapse. Machiavelli did not offer moral comfort. He offered a map. And the remarkable thing about that map is this: the territory has not changed in 500 years. Human nature remains almost exactly the same. The only question is whether you will use the map or continue wandering blindly. History offers a clear answer. The rulers who understood human nature built systems that lasted generations. The ones who believed only in noble sentiments were quickly overthrown and forgotten. And the same principle applies in ordinary life. Understanding these patterns is the difference between being used and being respected, between being abandoned and being valued, between living as a naive victim of circumstances and navigating relationships with strategy and clarity. So, welcome to reality. It is less comforting than the stories we like to believe, but it is the only place where real success and real understanding of people is possible.